This evening's debate will engage the two leading candidates in the first governor's recall election in the 164-year history of the state of Wisconsin, Governor Scott Walker and Milwaukee Mayor Tom Barrett. This is Tom Barrett. This evening's debate is made possible in part through generous grants from the Wisconsin Association of Independent Colleges and Universities and WPS Health Insurance. And now on their behalf, Mr. Rolf Rogenke and Mr. Jim Reardon.
Good evening. My name is Jim Reardon from WPS Health Insurance, and this is my friend Rolf Rogenke from the Wisconsin Association of Independent Colleges and Universities.
Along with WPS, Wisconsin's 22 private nonprofit colleges and our more than 60,000 students are pleased to sponsor this gubernatorial debate. To be competitive in the global knowledge economy, Wisconsin needs to expand educational opportunity. Wisconsin's private nonprofit colleges have been committed to excellence in education since before Wisconsin became a state. We believe that an educated and civil debate focused on the issues is essential for moving this state forward.
At WPS Health Insurance, we've been insuring Wisconsin's health since 1946. In that time, we've seen our society and government face growing challenges, especially in health care and health insurance. Like Rolf, we hope that our sponsorship of this debate will help you gain a better understanding of how each of these candidates would represent us and govern our state.
Please join us in watching this debate and in thinking about the future. Then, make your voice heard by voting on Tuesday, June 5th.
The format for this evening's debate will allow for each candidate to make an opening statement, to respond to questions from a panel of reporters, and to have one opportunity to ask a direct question of his opponent. And finally, for each candidate to make a closing statement. The order of responses has been previously decided by a coin flip. Our panelists this evening include Bob Dorr, news director for the radio stations of the Door County DailyNews.com in Sturgeon Bay, Aaron Davison, reporter anchor for WFRV-TV Green Bay, and Paul Piaskowski, reporter anchor for WDJT-TV Milwaukee. We will begin with a 1.5-minute opening statement. First, from Governor Walker.
Well, thanks, John. Thanks to the panel, and most of all, thanks to all of you for tuning in all across the state of Wisconsin. 2 years ago, I ran for governor because Wisconsin faced both an economic and a fiscal crisis. See, at the time, we had lost more than 100,000 jobs, and the state faced more than a $3 billion budget deficit. We knew we had to take action. So we balanced that budget without raising taxes, without massive layoffs, and without cuts in programs like Medicaid. In fact, we actually added money to Medicaid. You know, the program that funds Badger Care and Family Care? We put more money into Medicaid than any governor in Wisconsin history. Instead, we chose to balance our budget through long-term structural reforms, help to balance not just our state budget, but our local government budgets as well. What we did was about thinking more about the next generation than we did just about the next election. And isn't that what you elect us to do? The good news is our reforms are working. It's why largely our opponents don't talk about them anymore. We've documented more than $1 billion worth of savings, and that's led to property taxes going down for the first time in 12 years on a median valued home. That's why the state of Wisconsin now has a budget surplus of more than $154 million, and it's why, best of all, jobs were created in 2011, and since I was first sworn in as your governor, more than 30,000 people have gone back to work. We're turning things around. We're heading in the right direction. Together, we're moving Wisconsin forward.
Mayor Barrett, your opening statement.
Well, I want to thank you for hosting us tonight. Thank you. And again, thank you to all the listeners and all the people who are watching tonight. This election is not a rematch or a do-over, because we can't do over the decision of Scott Walker to start a political civil war, which resulted in this state losing more jobs than any other state in this entire country in 2011. A decision that tore apart this state and made it impossible in some instances for neighbors to talk to neighbors, for relatives to talk to relatives, for workers to talk to coworkers, because it was too bitter a fight. And we can't do over his decision to put his national ambitions ahead of the state of Wisconsin as he traveled around the country and became the rock star to Tea Party activists and billionaires who have funded his campaign with millions and millions of dollars of contributions, money that he has used to distort my record. This isn't a rematch or a do-over, because we can't do over the fact that Scott Walker's administration has been investigated, a criminal investigation that looks at the activities of some of his key aides while he was county executive. And his decision, his refusal to release secret emails that were on a system that was in his county executive office, and his failure to tell us who is raising his funds. This is about the future and about who will put Wisconsin first. I will put Wisconsin first.
Thank you. Our first question will be from Bob Dorr for Mayor Barrett.
Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
The first question is, why are we here? 20 months ago on this same stage, the two of you debated before the 2010 election to see who would be elected to a 4-year term. What's your view of why we're back here less than halfway through that first term?
Well, I think I answered that question in part in my opening statement. But we're really here because, again, Governor Walker made a decision. He made a decision that he would try to divide this state. And he used phrases when he was talking to his key donors, like he was going to drop the bomb, and he was going to divide and conquer this state. And he has. He has divided the state unlike anything we've ever seen. And as a result of that, what we have seen in this state is we saw hundreds of thousands of people in this democracy who decided that they wanted a change. They wanted an opportunity to get a governor who would put this state first. A governor who would focus on creating jobs in this state and not traveling around this country trying to enhance his national image. A governor who would restore trust to the governor's office. A governor who would end these divisions where neighbors can't talk to neighbors. And they want a governor who is going to end this civil war. Scott Walker started this political civil war. I will end this civil war. And that's something the citizens of this state want, because they understand that the real issue we face is jobs. And we have to have a governor who's going to focus on creating jobs in this state. Again, that is the governor who I will be.
Governor Walker?
Sure. Well, Bob, in answer to your question, I think it's about our reforms, and at least that's the way it started out. We don't hear a lot about it, I think largely because our reforms are working. You look at the last year and a half, and we've documented more than $1 billion worth of savings because of our reforms. That led to the first time in 12 years that property taxes on a median valued home has actually gone down. That's great news, not only for homeowners, for small business owners, but particularly for people on fixed income, senior citizens, and working families and others out there. We see our state now has a $154 million surplus, and for the first time, we put 2 consecutive years where we put money into the rainy day fund. Best of all, we saw in 2011, Wisconsin actually gained jobs. The mayor and his allies talk about a job number. It was based on a sample of 3.5% of the employers in the state. Our numbers are based on a survey of almost 160,000 employers. That's more than 96% of all the employers in the state of Wisconsin who are required by law to submit that information. They showed that last year Wisconsin gained jobs, and since I've taken office, we've had more than 30,000 new jobs in the state. Now, I understand why things have shifted, because if you look at my record and compare that with our opponent, the mayor of Milwaukee, in the last 8 years, taxes and fees in this city have gone up 43%. Sadly, Milwaukee is one of the poorest cities, big cities in the entire country. And the unemployment rate, well, it's gone up 28% in the city of Wisconsin, or city of Milwaukee. I think in contrast, people want to go forward. They want to move on. They want to get past this. They don't want to rehash the same debate we had, which is what the mayor's talked about in the primary. They want to move on and move forward, and I'm the candidate to do that.
A follow-up for both of you. Should the recall election laws in this state be changed?
30 seconds, please.
Well, I think Scott Walker is probably the best expert on that. He became county executive of Milwaukee County, something he doesn't want people to remind him, following a recall. And he has signed recall petitions, it's my understanding, against Senator Feingold, against Senator Cole, not for criminal misbehavior, but because he disagreed with political decisions that were made. The decisions that he made were the decisions that led to this recall.
Absolutely, absolutely, the law should be changed. I think Democrats, Republicans alike realize that spending $16, $17 million on another election is just a horrible waste of money. But it's the law right now. And at some point in the future, I think after this is all said and done, we'll move on as a state. We'll be able to move forward. And I think you'll see both Democrat and Republicans not only in the legislature, but I think voters all across the state that want to see it changed. I think that's something important. But today, we have a chance to debate the future, and I'm going to spend tonight talking about the future.
Our second question is from Aaron Davison, directed first at Governor Walker.
Change in public employee collective bargaining law last year is one of the reasons that we're here tonight. Governor Walker, if you had to do it all over again, would you seek the same changes in the same way? And do you plan more collective bargaining law changes? And Mayor Barrett, if you disagree with the changes that Governor Walker made, some of which you used to your advantage in the City of Milwaukee budgeting process, would you seek to undo those changes? And if so, how would you go about it?
Well, Aaron, that's a great question. I get asked that a lot out on the campaign trail. Looking back, without a doubt, I'd change how we did things. I think in the end, the results, and people say this all over the state, they like the results. They just wish we'd done it different. I think if I had a chance to do it again, if I'd gone out last January and early February and made the case all across the state of Wisconsin and explained what was happening back then. Because remember, before our reforms, school districts all across the state were literally spending tens of millions of dollars more than they needed to because under collective bargaining, they were forced to buy their health insurance from essentially just one company. In fact, I talked to a small business owner today in Cuba City at a farm just outside of Cuba City on the west side of Grant County, and he talked about working with school districts all across southwestern Wisconsin. And literally the money that they've saved is money that's gone right back into the classroom. If I told people that was what was at stake back then, I think most people, most taxpayers, be they Democrat or Republican, would have said, Governor, you need to fix it. If I talked about how under the old collective bargaining system, you had abuses in overtime in places like the city of Madison where a bus driver was able to make $150,000 because of overtime abuse, I think most taxpayers would have said, you need to fix it. My problem was I fixed it, then I talked about it. Most politicians spend all their time talking about it, but never fix it. In the future, we're going to both talk about it and fix it. We understand the product is ultimately the most important thing, but the process itself is very important. It's why I spent the last year working with Dr. Tony Evers on education reform. We're going to continue to build off that pace where we bring stakeholders in and ultimately create a good product and a good process.
Scott, you started this by saying that you were going to drop the bomb and that you were going to go first after the public employees, and that you would use divide and conquer as your strategy to go after the workers, and that you would use a budget bill to tear this state apart. I think of great leaders like Franklin Roosevelt, leaders like Giuliani, and what did they do at a time of crisis? They tried to bring their people together. You decided to use a budget crisis to try to divide and conquer this state. That's what happened. That's what led to all of this. And you succeeded. You succeeded in dividing this state. But you said it was the first step. Because this is really about workers' rights. And it's not just about public employees. It's about the middle class and whether people who work in the middle class have rights, whether they have safety rights. Because I've talked to people who are working in our prisons right now, and they've said they've never been more afraid because their rights were taken away. I am concerned about those rights. I'm concerned that those rights have been taken away, and I think it's an attack on the middle class. There's a reason he hasn't said he would veto a right-to-work bill, and the reason is because he wouldn't.
Our next question is from Paul Piaskowski, directed first at Mayor Barrett.
Well, you've both touched on this. I think it's clear you both recognize that job creation is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, issues in this race. But lately, how we count jobs lost or created has become equally important and controversial. You're both working from different sets of numbers, and with the short run-up to this race, voters are now, in effect, being asked to place their bets. And so my question for you is, with so many livelihoods and families at stake all across Wisconsin, why should voters bet on you?
Mayor Barrett?
Let me explain the numbers that I'm using. I'm using the numbers that Scott Walker embraced last year. I'm using the numbers that are used by every state, by the federal government, by the media. The Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers. Excuse me, and those are the numbers that showed under Scott Walker this state lost more jobs than any other state in the country in 2011. And Scott realized he had a problem. He had a problem. Because he could not run for this election knowing that the people of this state would know that we lost the most jobs of any state in the country. So he brought his key political appointees together and said, we need to have a different measurement. And so they brought a measurement out 20 days before this election. 20 days before this election. And had TV commercials running 4 hours later saying, let's use this set of numbers instead. Those numbers have never been verified. And he knows they couldn't be verified. And as a result of that, if we were to believe his numbers, the Bureau of Labor Statistics would have had the largest discrepancy it has ever had, the largest mistake it's ever had, the largest mistake ever. It's clear what's going on. He can't defend his record on jobs, so they trot out these numbers that are not used for this fashion ordinarily, and they put tens of millions of dollars behind them in commercials, trying to convince the people of the state that we've created jobs, when in fact the state has lost jobs.
Well, Paul, the answer is simple. The facts are the facts. Our reforms are working and putting more people to work. The monthly numbers, the numbers we originally looked at, the numbers that the mayor's hanging his hat on, our numbers are based on a sample of 3.5% of all the employers in the state. That's why you have a quarterly review of those, and you would talk to nearly every employer in the state of Wisconsin. In this case, almost 160,000 employers responded. That's 96% versus 3.5%. Those numbers showed in 2011, Wisconsin gained 23,321. Those are numbers that come directly by law, are required to come from the employers of the state of Wisconsin. Those are numbers that are submitted and were required to be submitted on May 16th of 2012. That's what the law requires. Now, I think the reason why there's all the attention about the process is because that's the disconnect from the attacks that I've been under for month after month by our opponent. Well, largely because if you look at the contrast, we've seen our employment rate go down to 6.7%, the lowest it's been since 2008 in the state of Wisconsin. We've seen 30,000 new jobs created since I first took office. In contrast, in the city of Milwaukee, unemployment's gone up 28%. It is now literally one of the poorest cities in the entire country. Unemployment's above 10%. I've said time and time again, we don't want Wisconsin to become Milwaukee. We want to help Milwaukee and other cities that are in challenge right now become more like the good things that we've done in the state of Wisconsin. And that's what we're going to do moving the state forward.
May I respond?
Yes. But no, wait, no, you already had.
I thought there was time for a 30-second rebuttal, but if there's not.
No, and that's in direct questioning. Our next question is from Bob Doerr, directed first at Governor Walker.
Most of the last budget debate was focused on the spending side of the ledger, cutting spending to bring the budget in balance. Would like to talk about the other side right now, the revenue side, taxes, tax increases, tax cuts, and specifically how you define a tax increase. If a tax credit or a deduction gets removed, is that a tax increase? What about previous spending cuts? If they get restored, is that a tax increase? Or things like licensing fees, increased paperwork filing fees, if those get increased, is that considered a tax increase? So I'd like to know, first of all, your definition of a tax increase, and then looking ahead to the next budget, if you plan any of those.
Well, overall, what we've done is lower the overall tax burden in the state of Wisconsin on this budget. Probably the most important thing we did was putting caps on property taxes. It's a difference that I've had between not only myself and the mayor, but the other Democrats who are running, who raised real concerns about that. I want to keep caps in place so that we keep property taxes down. For the first time in 12 years, property taxes on a median value at home, because of our budget, went down. That's after from 1998 to last year, property taxes in the state went up on average about 43%. That's bad for homeowners. It's bad for small businesses, particularly when it comes to bad for homeowners. It's bad for senior citizens of fixed incomes. It's bad for working families and others out there. That probably more than any tax out there is the biggest issue. But on top of that, we put in place tax incentives for job creation. I was at a forum in Grant County earlier today. I've been at plenty of forums and manufacturing sites and others across the state, and they benefit from our tax incentives. They're putting more people back to work, largely driven by the change in attitude in the state of Wisconsin, because they've shown that we're putting more money back in their hands so they can in turn invest in capital and innovation and putting people to work in the state of Wisconsin. I think that's not just a definition of a tax decrease. I think more importantly, it's a definition of what it takes to get the state working again. That's a fundamental difference between the two of us. I don't believe that more government's the answer. I believe that getting government out of the way and being a good partner is the answer, not adding more of a burden on our small businesses and particularly on our farmers and manufacturers in the state. That's not the way to go. I want to move our state forward.
Mayor Barrett?
I want to respond to a statement that Scott said earlier in his continuing to tax and divide and conquer strategy, this time trying to pit people against the city of Milwaukee. As Scott well knows, during the period that he was county executive, unemployment went up in Milwaukee County 34% during the time he was county executive. Debt went up 85% during the time he was county executive. And he introduced a budget in his last year that had a $40 million increase over his first budget. But he doesn't even want the people of this state to remember that he was ever the county executive of this county. Now, I agree with you that revenues are an issue here. And Scott has not called the increase that seniors pay because of the steps he took to limit the homestead tax credit a tax increase. I would call that a tax increase. I would call that a tax increase that hits seniors in this state, seniors who are on fixed incomes. But it all comes to trust how you define things and measure them. Because he also said that we're running a budget surplus right now. Well, you know how that budget surplus came about, if it is in fact there? Because he used the credit card. He used the credit card and pushed over $500 million of debt onto our children and our grandchildren. And they're going to have to pay more than $150 million in interest so that he can look good politically. That's not a trustworthy action.
Our next question is from Aaron Davison, directed first at Mayor Barrett.
A recent survey claimed that about half of all the money raised in this campaign will come from out of the state of Wisconsin, when previous averages were between 7 and 10%. What is the rationale for that, and how does this impact the influence of Wisconsin voters?
Well, I think that's a question you probably want to ask Scott, because if you look at the primary, if you look at our most recent report, 99% of my contributions came from individuals. 91% of those contributions came from people who contributed less than $100. And about 85% of them came from people who live in the state of Wisconsin. Now, this is something that people in this state get. There is something wrong when a sitting governor raises 60 to 70% of his most recent campaign contributions from people who don't live in the state, from a billionaire in Texas, from developers in Missouri. Do you think for 1 second those people care about what's happening in Superior or Sturgeon Bay or Stevens Point or Sturtevant or Sharon? No, they don't. This is all part of this ideological civil war. He wants this state to be the prototype for the Tea Party nationally. That's why he's such a rock star. They love him. The conservatives love him. The right wing loves him because he's doing exactly what they want him to do. He's not doing what the people in Wisconsin want them to do, but he is pleasing these billionaires. And there is something wrong. There is something wrong when you have a sitting governor who's raised 60 to 70% of his money from out of state.
Governor Walker?
Well, you look at where it started. Last February, March, we saw millions of dollars poured into the state of Wisconsin from out-of-state special interests trying to attack our reforms. They spent them on TV. They brought thousands of people into the state of Wisconsin. That continued in the Supreme Court race. It continued spending tens of millions of dollars trying to take out 6 Republican state senators in the recall elections themselves. And we've seen it all throughout the recall process itself. We wouldn't have to raise or spend a penny in this election if it weren't for the out-of-state special interest. And they continue to pour. We just saw reports this week of more money coming in from the Democrat Governors Association and from pouring into the Greater Wisconsin Committee, which is a front group for all the union money coming in there. What you've seen is people from across the state, and many, yes, from across the country, saying, you know what? Here's a governor who's willing to stand up and take on the powerful special interest and instead do something that's unique. Put the power back in the hands of the hardworking taxpayers. That's what we did. And that's why there's so much interest from Washington about trying to defeat us. Because they understand, not just for other Republican governors, but frankly, there's a lot of discerning Democrats who are governors and mayors all across the country who are looking closely here saying, maybe it's time we took on the special interest as well and put the power back in the hands of the hardworking taxpayers. That's the difference in this election. You know, that's why not only across the state, but others who've helped us out, more than 76% of all our donations come from people who've given us $50 or less. So whether it's someone here in Wisconsin or someone across the way in Dubuque or down the way in Rockford or somewhere else, they understand that finally someone's willing to stand up and take on those special interests.
Our next question is from Paul Piaskowski, directed first to John Walker. To Governor Walker.
Governor, 3 of your former aides have now been charged criminally as part of an ongoing John Doe investigation here in Milwaukee County. One of them has already pled guilty to doing campaign work on public time. 12 people have been granted immunity as cooperating witnesses. You've said repeatedly that you're not a target in this investigation. But what, if any, responsibility do you bear for activities that took place in your office and on your watch as county executive? And Mr. Mayor, on the same topic, you've said repeatedly that the governor needs to come clean about what he knows, implying that he's either withholding information about this investigation or that he's actually done something wrong. Do you have any information to support that implication? And if not, is it responsible to suggest as much until and unless we've heard definitively from prosecutors?
Governor Walker?
Oh, sure. Paul, first off, let me be clear. Set the stage here. I've had a high level of integrity all the way back to my early days as a kid when I earned the rank of Eagle Scout, and have shown that during my time in the state assembly, as the county executive, now as the governor of the state of Wisconsin. I will continue to have high integrity long after I'm in this position and long after this whole process is completed. It's important to look at the facts. The facts clearly show that any time it was brought to our attention that someone violated our very strict policy against using taxpayer resources for political purposes, we took swift action. Those are the facts. Those have clearly been out there. You've talked about it in the media right here and all across the state of Wisconsin. The other interesting thing I'd like to think for a lot of people tuning in tonight is to know this investigation started because my office asked for it nearly 2 years ago. We had concerns about someone who was involved with a veterans-related program, and we asked the district attorney to look into it. That's why we're involved in this process. That's why we continue to cooperate, and that's why, as you mentioned, we haven't been the target of this. There's nothing new here. The reason I think the mayor and our opponents wanted to spend so much time on this is they want to distract attention because they're desperate. The things that this election was supposedly about, the reforms, are things they don't talk about anymore because they're working. $1 billion worth of savings, property taxes down, more jobs being created, a budget surplus. They don't want to talk about that, and they certainly don't want to talk about the mayor's record here in the city of Milwaukee, where unemployment's gone up 28%, where even this past week we learned that violent crime we thought was down and sadly is actually going up. That's the reason why they're focusing on this.
Mayor Barrett?
Scott Walker is the only governor in this country who has a criminal defense fund. He's paid over $100,000 in criminal defense fees to a lawyer who specializes in federal prosecutions and a different lawyer who specializes in state prosecutions. You're correct. His key aides have been charged. And it involved the network in his office, in his executive office, 25 feet, about the distance we are from each other, where there was a secret computer system that did fundraising, did campaigning, and when he found out about it, did he order an investigation? No. He sent one email, and he said, we can't afford to have any more stories. His concerns were about public relations, not about criminal investigations. I've asked for two things. I've asked for him to clear the record and to show us the emails that he sent to that criminal enterprise, if you will, that secret system, that secret computer system in his office. That would clear the whole thing up. I didn't make any allegations he did anything wrong. I want to clear the air. I also asked that he tells us who's paying his criminal defense fees. The people in the state have a right to know who is paying his criminal defense fees. That doesn't raise any charges against him. But that's what we have a right to know, and that's what I've asked.
Our next question is from Bob Dorr, directed first at Mayor Barrett.
Last year, a large contingent of Senate Democrats left the state to prevent that body from voting and getting a quorum to vote on the budget bill. Now that precedent has been set, it could happen from lawmakers from either party. And my question is, first of all, what's your view of the practice? And secondly, if elected governor, how would you deal with it if it happens, or help prevent it if you don't want it to happen?
This all goes to leadership and how you deal with people. And I think Scott himself acknowledged that he did not deal with the introduction of this bill in the way that was probably the best. I think that's maybe the understatement of the year. But my view has always been that you seek to work with people, that you seek to explain to them what's going on, so that you don't face these huge civil wars. And they're divisive. And again, he said that was his plan. His plan was to divide and conquer. That's not how you get things done. I balanced 8 budgets as the mayor of this city. And I've done so by working with people. And it doesn't mean you're always going to agree. It doesn't even mean you're always going to have pleasant conversations. You might have some sharp exchanges. But I think the job of an executive is to set the tone for the organization. whether it's how people act in their office in terms of criminal activity or in terms of how you act with your legislature. And what his decision was to drop the bomb. Again, that's his phrase. That's not my phrase. That's his phrase, to drop the bomb. And he was upset that people acted in a negative way. Do I think that that's something we want to see repeated? Of course I don't. Of course, I don't think anybody in the state, even the people who left, don't want to see that repeated. And I think, tragically, one of the things we've learned, and we've learned it the hard way, is that you have to have an executive that's willing to work with people, not try to paint people into a corner or make themselves look big by making someone else look small.
Governor Walker?
Well, Bob, I recently met a woman in Sheboygan who came up to me, introduced herself, and then said, "I'm a Democrat." I waited for a second to see what was going to come out next, and she said, but I support you. You've sold me. I said, "Well, you haven't even heard me talk yet." I said, "Well," she said, "it's not what you say, it's what you do." She said, "I've been looking for someone who's been willing to take on the tough issues." She said, "I don't agree with everything you've done, and I certainly don't necessarily agree with every step that you've taken, but I appreciate the fact that someone's really ultimately been willing to take on the tough issues, to take on our fiscal and economic crisis in this state." And so we've taken on that first tough battle. It's time for us to move forward. When we talked about our job session at the beginning of this past legislative session, nearly every one of those items was passed with bipartisan support. We did it again in the fall when Democrats and Republicans joined together with us in that. In fact, if you look at all the bills I signed into law this session, over 96% of them were bills that both Democrats and Republicans voted for. We can build off of that. But you don't do that if you replay the tough battle we've had over the last year and a half. The mayor, my opponent, talked about this all throughout the primary, that he wants to go back and completely restore collective bargaining. That means we're going to have that battle all over again. In fact, in the primary at some of the forums, he said he was going to get in the ring and fight and fight and fight. And if somebody didn't go his way, he was going to target them and take them out. Members of the legislature went on his side. He'd target them and take them out. It doesn't sound like somebody who's ready to move on and move this state forward. We're ready to move on. We're ready to move forward. We don't want to replay those battles. We think it's time to get this state working again and move forward.
Our next question is from Aaron Davison, directed first at Governor Walker.
Let's talk about mining. Earlier this year, Gogebic Taconite canceled plans for an iron mine near Ashland, Wisconsin, when lawmakers couldn't pass the mining bill. Mining in Wisconsin will continue to be a topic of concern. What can we learn from our neighboring state of Minnesota about workable mining legislation, and how can Wisconsin best balance the need to protect our environmental resources with demand for job opportunities available through the mining industry?
Well, this is a good example of working together. We work with private sector unions, a number of them who were passionate not only about mining, but we work together with on restoring the raids on the transportation system and putting more investments into energy and power in the state of Wisconsin. They were very active in supporting our legislation to streamline the process for safe and environmentally sound mining. I crisscrossed the state advocating for that, not only in northwestern Wisconsin, but because that mine would have generated some 2,300 jobs. I spent time, whether it was here in Milwaukee with P&H and Caterpillar, whether it was down in Clinton with the Walker Forge down there, no relation to me, or whether it's with places all across the state where you see jobs that would have been created from that mine. We're going to advocate for that. Sadly, this is an example of what happens with the recall politics. Overwhelming support from Washington said to those Senate Democrats, you can't pass this legislation. You can't give the governor a victory. I believe very firmly we get past June 5th. We can put together a process that not only Republicans in the Senate, but I think a number of Democrats can support in moving the state forward. And our private sector unions are going to be a key part of that.
This piece of legislation is an excellent example of what happens when you've got a governor who's more interested in traveling around the country giving fundraising speeches than working on a piece of key legislation. And it's not just this piece of legislation, it's the venture capital bill. Scott Walker said that key economic development initiatives were passed in January. No, they weren't. These were his two key economic development initiatives, and neither one of them passed. Now, why didn't they pass? They didn't pass because you had a governor who was not interested in taking off his jacket and rolling up his sleeves and working with people. I'll tell you what I would have done. I'll tell you what a good executive would have done on the mining bill. A good executive would have brought in the environmentalists, the Native Americans, local government, and the company, and said, is there a need for this mine? What can we do to make this work? He never, ever did that. Not once. The venture capital is an even better example. Because that one he can't blame the Democrats on. Because it was the Assembly Republicans and the Senate Republicans who disagreed. Can't blame the Democrats for that. And he never brought them in. He never rolled up his sleeves and did the hard work that an executive has to do. Because he was having too much fun traveling around the country. We have to have a governor who is going to be here and focus on creating jobs in this state rather than advancing their career nationally.
Our next question is from Paul Piaskowski, directed first to Mayor Barrett.
Mayor Barrett, in 2006, voters here in Wisconsin decided to amend the state constitution, effectively banning gay marriage. But this seems to be one of those issues on which public and political opinions are shifting fairly rapidly. As we all know, the president came out recently in support of gay marriage. The NAACP shortly thereafter declared marriage equality a civil right. And a national poll out just this week, in fact, done by ABC News and the Washington Post, showed that 53% of Americans now favor the legalization of gay marriage, compared with 36% back in 2006 when Wisconsin voted. I'm curious as to whether or not your opinions have also evolved or changed at all since that vote on this issue. And for instance, if a measure legalizing civil unions were to emerge from the Wisconsin legislature, how you might respond to that as governor.
I would support that. I believe in marriage equality, and I think that it is an issue where opinions have evolved. And it's interesting because I think for younger people in particular, I think that they understand the need to respect relationships. And I do respect them. But I think the issue here goes beyond that, because I think there are other issues that are important to this state where there is a disagreement between Scott Walker and me. And one of them has to do with equal pay for equal work. And that's an issue, again, where we have a sharp disagreement. Because there is a federal law, the Lilly Ledbetter law, that ensures that women will not be paid less than men for the same work. I support that legislation. Similar legislation was passed at the state level, so that someone who lives in Dunn County or someone who lives in Iowa County or someone who lives in Florence County doesn't have to take their case to a federal court. Instead, they can take it to a state court. Scott Walker and his allies repealed that law, repealed a law that gave a state court remedy so that women and veterans and others who had been paid less than they were worth, that they could have redress in our state courts. Those are issues that are important to me. Treating people with dignity, making sure that this state respects all people.
Governor Walker?
Sure. Well, Paul, good question. I took an oath in office to uphold the Constitution of the state of Wisconsin, and the Constitution very clearly defines marriages between one man and one woman. I continue to support that. On the issue the mayor just talked about, his only disagreement is with the facts. The facts in this state are it's against the law today, and it will continue to be every day I'm in office. It's against the law in the state of Wisconsin today to discriminate against a woman based on employment, either on a promotion or employment itself, against a woman, or to discriminate in pay based on gender. That's the law today. It's a law we've enforced and will continue to enforce, and media outlet after media outlet has pointed out that the mayor's attacks are just plain false on it. That is the law. It was the law before 2009. It's the law today. And every day I'm in office as your governor, I'll continue to stand up and enforce the law to ensure that not just women in general, but I think about not only my own kids, but particularly my nieces, Isabella and Eva, who are young right now, but someday when they enter the workforce, I want to make sure that law is fully intact so that someone's just standing up and defending their right to get equal pay as well. And as long as I'm governor, I'll continue to take that fight.
Our next question is from Bob Doerr, directed first to Governor Walker.
What is the state of the state's educational system? UW system, technical colleges, K-12, are we in better shape than we were 2 years ago? And is it well positioned to help with things like job creation and economic development?
Well, I think it is. And I said I've had a vested interest throughout this whole process. I've got two sons, Matt and Alex, who go to a public high school just down the way from where we're standing here today. And for them and every other kid in this state, I want to make sure that every kid, no matter what zip code they live in, no matter where they come from across the state, have access to a great education. One of the most underreported things that's positive about our reforms isn't just the savings, isn't just the budgetary issues. It's the benefits it's provided to our traditional public schools across the state. I mentioned earlier, for years, schools all across Wisconsin essentially had to buy their health insurance from just one company. That meant tens of millions of dollars that they had to spend on that health insurance plan instead of putting that money directly in the classroom. That's changed because of our reforms. On top of that, we had an example years ago, long before I was governor here, where A young woman in the Milwaukee public school system was named one of the outstanding new teachers of the year. Exactly the kind of teacher you'd want in any school district across the state. A couple of weeks after that announcement, she found out she was being laid off, long before I was governor, because of cuts that were made in the past. Well, the reality was, under the old system of collective bargaining, the last one hired was the first one fired. The last one in was the first one out. The mayor and his allies want to restore that system that would put in place seniority and tenure. I want to keep a system that says, you know what? Merit should drive hiring. And we should pay based on performance. That means we can put the best and the brightest in our classrooms. Even the survey conducted each year for the last 10 years by the statewide teachers union has said that this year, it's why they wanted to hide that information from the public, showed that the responses were more positive this year than they've been at any time over the past 10 years.
I can't think of an organization where you take $1.6 billion out of their budget in the state of Wisconsin that's going to be better off. And that's exactly what Scott Walker did. Took $1.6 billion out of K-12 in the state. But it didn't end there. Technical schools took a 30% cut. University system took a $315 million cut. We have to invest in our kids. I've got 4 kids as well. I want my kids to be able to get an education in this state and not come out of college in buckets of debt. That's what I want. But to not invest in education is penny wise and pound foolish. And all you have to do is look at Minnesota. That is a much higher per capita income than this state. And one of the main reasons is more of their residents have graduated from college or technical school. And what did Scott Walker try to do? Again, the divide and conquer strategy, where he tried to pit the University of Wisconsin-Madison against the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, Stevens Point, Superior, Stout, you name it. And what would have been the result of that? It would have driven up tuition costs for students at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and more students would have come from out of state. I want our flagship university to be a place where our students can attend, and not to be a place where dollars are going to be the main goal so that we can get students from out of state.
Our next question is from Aaron Davison, directed first at Mayor Barrett.
Well over 1 million people in Wisconsin, or 1 in 5 residents, rely on some sort of medical assistance paid for by the state. And while these programs offer a safety net for people with disabilities, children, and low-income families, they are costly. How can the state rein in expenses while still providing for people who would not otherwise have access to health care?
Well, I think one of the beginning tenets that we have to use is that if people have jobs, we want to make sure they have health care, because we don't want people to be forced to quit their job because they don't have health care. And we don't want situations where mothers who don't have health insurance are forced to go to emergency rooms. Because if you're a mother with a sick 8-month-old and your baby's running a temperature of 104 and you don't have a primary care physician, I want you to go to the emergency room if you love your baby. But that's the most expensive and inefficient way to deliver health care. It almost seems like a ironic tradition, but as a member of Congress, I worked on a bipartisan basis to get Badger Care approved. Badger Care was approved on a bipartisan basis so that people who were working could get health care. I think we have to continue to invest in Badger Care. And there were people who lost their Badger Care under Scott Walker's budget. And he attempted to make severe cuts to senior care, a program that allowed seniors to get prescription drugs. And that was a rare bipartisan occurrence because it was put back in the budget on a bipartisan basis so that seniors would not lose their prescription coverage. And it was only when the federal government threatened action that he decided to take action on family care. To me, that went to trust, to have the governor say that he wants to restore family care, but then we find out he said it because the federal government had threatened the state. That's a problem.
Governor Walker?
Well, first off, you make an investment. We put $1.2 billion more into Medicaid than was in there in the past. In fact, I invested more money into Medicaid, the program that funds Badger Care and family care in the state, than any governor in Wisconsin history. If you compare us around the country, while Illinois failed to make the tough decisions that we've made over the past year, and they're now cutting, I think, something like $2.7 billion from Medicaid, we added money. We added more money than just about any governor in the country. But we also put in place reforms to make sure it was sustainable. So we could provide a safety net for our elders as part of family care. So we could continue to add people who would have physical and developmental disabilities as part of family care. And so certainly we provide a basic safety net for needy families and children under Badger Care. You can't do that without an investment, but also without putting in reforms that say simple things like If you're on Badger Care and your employer has health insurance, we're going to ask you to take health insurance from your employer instead of relying on the taxpayers. If you're someone in your early 20s and you can get health insurance on your parents, we're going to ask you to get it there instead of going on the taxpayers. Those are the sorts of things that ensure that Medicaid and the programs funded under things like Badger Care and Family Care are there for generations to come. We really don't know, other than what we just heard a moment ago from the mayor, as to what he's going to do, because it's been 44 days since he was first asked, saying, you know, if this is about undoing the past year and a half, what would you do? Well, he hasn't told the voters. He doesn't have a plan. A few talking points is not a plan. We have a plan. We've laid it on the table. We've invested money into Medicaid. We will in the future.
We have time for one last question, and that will come from Paul Piaskowski, directed first to the governor.
Governor, this is a bit of an understatement, but over the past year and a half, there's been ideological warfare, to say the least, going on in the state capitol. We've got hard Democrats on the right, hard Republicans on the right, hard Democrats on the left, and many would say that the state is polarized at this point. So our question is, what would you do to bring unity back to the state of Wisconsin? What can you do?
I think one of the biggest things is moving on past the June 5th election. Because we've got a real choice here. And I think voters need to understand, we get past June 5th, we can get back to focusing on jobs and education reform and other issues where in the past we've worked together on across party lines and broad consensus around the state. We can move this state forward. Going back and rehashing the same debate we had last year, as my opponent wants to do, is not the way to move forward. What I want to do is build off of a foundation of a process we've changed. I talked about earlier about improving the process as well as getting a good product. We started out last March with Dr. Tony Evers, who ideologically wouldn't necessarily be aligned with us, but we have a shared interest. I personally, because of my two kids in a public school, the superintendent because of his overall interest in public education in the state. We worked on improving reading scores and involvement for elementary school kids. We worked on educator effectiveness, and our staffs put together one of the most comprehensive group of stakeholders from across the state when it came to school and school district accountability. There's much more work to be done together on that. And I think that process gives us a great foundation, whether it's on education or assortment of other issues, where we can build off that and really bring the state together in the future. And I think the public doesn't have to say he's talking about it. We've actually done it for almost a year. The reason most people don't know about it is because it's working. It hasn't been controversial. We brought together a good number of people and built consensus. We can do that again when it comes to jobs and budgets and other things in the future.
Mayor Barrett.
The first thing you have to do is establish trust. And you don't establish trust when 20 days before an election, you trot out a whole new set of employment numbers that people can see right through. And you don't establish trust when you know that you've got a deficit, and instead of dealing with that deficit honestly, you take out the credit card and say, I want to make myself look good politically, so our kids will pay $156 million more in interest. That doesn't establish trust. I was elected in 2004 as mayor. It was a deeply, deeply divided election. There were bad feelings afterwards. And I reached out to people who did not support me. I did not try to punish my political enemies. Because if you're mayor or you're governor, you have to be the executive for the entire jurisdiction. Scott won with 52% last time, and you would have thought he won with 92%. And the first step he took was to punish his enemies. That's easy to do. It's easy to punish your enemies, but it doesn't bring people together. The job of an executive is to try to work to get things done. And it can't be, it's my way or the highway. It's my way or the highway. It can't be, it's just an ideological litmus test, and we don't care what the practical results are. I want to work with people. And my style has never been that I make myself look big by making someone else look small, or that I try to push people into a corner politically. That's the type of executive that we need.
Now each candidate will have the opportunity to ask one question of the other. I'd ask you to keep your response, because of time, to 45 seconds. Governor Walker, you may question Mayor Barrett first, and then have an opportunity to respond.
Actually, I'll have more time to ask me a question. I'm going to skip it, just like I did 2 years ago. I think the voters don't want to hear us bickering. They just want to hear us answer questions. So with that, I'll defer to the mayor.
Mayor Barrett?
Well, then I'll take even more time. No, but Scott, you probably think I'm going to ask you a question about the John Doe criminal investigation and why you won't tell the people of the state who is paying your legal defense fees, or why you refuse to turn over those emails. But that's a question that's been asked, and I think the public want to have an answer to that. I'm equally concerned, though. There was recently an investigative report that talked about your travel, and it talked about your schedule, and it had days and days that were filled with personal time. And this investigative analysis went on to find that many of those times you were caught out of state giving political speeches or fundraising events, and you have refused to tell the public what your schedule has been as it pertains to fundraising and political events outside the state. Prior to this election, will you disclose to the people of this state your out-of-state travel for fundraising and political purposes?
I think it's real simple. To the people, for example, in Green Bay who 6 times in the last 11 days have seen me in their community, to the people I saw in southwestern Wisconsin and Grant County, and talked to people in Iowa and Richland County and Lafayette County and others, to the people who I just saw the other day in Oshkosh and Chippewa Falls and Eau Claire, I think they know where I'm at. They know where my interest is. I'm focused on the people of Wisconsin. What I've done is stand up and take on the powerful special interests. That's why they poured money in since last year. That's why they brought money and bodies into the state of Wisconsin, because I did something that hadn't been done before. I stood up and took on the powerful special interests at both the state and the local level, who in the past had dictated to taxpayers what they were going to do. Instead, I put the power back in the hands of the taxpayers, and every day I'm going to be fighting to do that here in the state of Wisconsin.
Mayor Barrett, do you wish to respond to that, 30 seconds or less?
Again, he didn't answer the question. I think it's imperative that the people of the state know why their governor was not here and what he was doing outside of the state raising money. But I think we have his answer.
Well, again, John, I'd say for the 30 seconds back, I think actions speak louder than words. People have seen me. People have seen me all across the state fighting to help the people of the state, not the government, create jobs. They've seen me standing up to take on the special interests, to put power back in the hands of the taxpayers. It's why today I talked to one of the local officials in southwestern Wisconsin, who said, finally, thankfully, someone's given us the power to act at the local level on behalf of the local taxpayers instead of someone else dictating to us what was going to happen.
That concludes the question and answer portion of our debate. Each candidate will now have the opportunity to make a 1.5-minute closing statement. Mayor Barrett, your statement.
Well, again, thank you all for watching tonight. I want to make something clear. I have no desire to be the rock star for the far right in this nation. And I have no desire to be the rock star of the far left in this nation. What I do have a desire is to be rock solid and do everything I can to create jobs in the state of Wisconsin. Because that's what we need right now. And we need a governor who will stand up to the special interests. And I will do that. Scott Walker gave billions of dollars in tax cuts to corporations and the wealthiest people in the state. And he asked seniors to sacrifice. I've said no to my friends. In fact, Scott's talked a lot about the unions tonight, the large public unions. Let's face it, I wasn't their first choice. And I'm certainly not the first choice of the people on the far right. And why is that? Because I've said no to my friends and to people who oppose me politically. That's the test of leadership. It's easy to say yes to people who give you millions of dollars. It's easy to say no to your political opponents. The real test of leadership is whether you can say no to people who are your friends. Scott Walker has never asked for shared sacrifice. He's asked for others to make sacrifice. As governor, I will focus on jobs, healing this state, ending his civil war, and doing everything we can to move this state forward. That's why I ask you for your vote on June 5th. Thank you very much.
Governor Walker.
John, I want to thank you and the Broadcasters Association, to the panel, Bob, Aaron, and Paul, and to the mayor for joining me here tonight, and particularly, most importantly, to all of you across the state of Wisconsin. Early this week, I stopped at a manufacturer in Oshkosh, and after talking to people working there all around the factory, I met somebody particularly interesting. A guy by the name of Chris came up to me and told me the story about how he had voted for my opponent 2 years ago, but how he and his parents, who were raised Democrats, were actually voting for me in this election. So the reason was simple. He was impressed that somebody finally had the courage to take on the tough issues facing our state, to help us move the state forward. Now, I often chuckle when I hear the word courage, because to me it's amazing that politics is the only profession out there where you're somehow called courageous just by keeping your word. What we're doing is moving this state forward, and the courage I get doesn't come from those in politics. It comes from the people I meet every day. Moms and dads all across the state, just like Tonette and I, who work hard in factories and farms and small businesses, in schools and clinics all across this great state. People I have the honor of meeting just about every day. People who are moms and dads just like Tonette and I, who have the courage to go to their workplaces and work hard, not just to earn a paycheck, not just to put food on the table or clothes in the back of our kids. They work hard each and every day just like Tonette and I do for the same reason. We want our kids to have a better life than we do. We ultimately want our kids to grow up in a better home, in a better community, and most importantly in a better state than the one we inherited. That's why I asked for your vote on June 5th to move Wisconsin forward.
That concludes this evening's debate. We thank the candidates, Mayor Tom Barrett and Governor Scott Walker, and our panelists. And on behalf of Wisconsin's radio and television broadcasters, we urge you to vote. We urge you to vote on June 5th. Thank you for listening and watching. Good night.